The teenager was running along the airport runway, desperately shouting that the jet had been sabotaged. No one wanted to listen to him, but the millionaire decided to stop and hear him out. The next day, he showed up at the boy's doorstep. Tommy's fingers dug into the sticky grime of an aluminum can as he tossed it into his half-filled garbage bag. The sun beat down hard, the heat bouncing off the concrete near the airport, the air thick and suffocating. He kept his eyes on the tarmac of the Teterboro airport, watching the private jets come and go. He could hear the hum of engines above the chatter of passengers getting ready to board. It wasn't envy exactly, but Tommy felt a twinge every time he looked over. His world felt so small compared to the people boarding those jets, each of them likely heading off to somewhere incredible. Tommy stood up, stretching his legs. His tall, lanky frame seemed a little out of place among the scattered trash bags and dirt patches by the fence. He wore his usual, worn jeans, a faded t-shirt, and old sneakers that were starting to pinch his feet. He didn't pay much attention to it. He couldn't afford to. His focus was on finishing up with the cans and getting back to his mom. He glanced over at the row of private jets. They were just sitting there, shiny and white, their windows tinted black. He wondered what it was like inside. "Hey, you! Get away from there!" a gruff voice echoed. Tommy turned, spotting one of the security guards headed in his direction. The man's face was scrunched in irritation, his uniform too tight around his belly. He pointed a stubby finger at Tommy. "I'm not doing anything," Tommy called back, lifting his hands, showing they were empty. The guard grumbled as he got closer, his face flushed. "You're too close. Don't make me tell you again, kid. You know you're not supposed to be here. Back off." Tommy nodded, backing up a step. He grabbed the handle of his garbage bag, the cans rattling inside. "I'm just picking up trash. I ain't bothering no one." The guard stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, well, don't give me a reason to call the cops. Understand?" Tommy gave another nod, staying quiet this time. The guard finally walked away, mumbling under his breath. Tommy watched until he disappeared back toward the main building. Then he turned back to his task. He looked down at his bag, sighing. He had a couple more spots to hit before he could head back home. He picked up the bag and started towards the next spot, near another set of fences. As he walked, he heard the roar of an engine overhead, a jet taking off into the sky. He paused, looking up at it, his neck craning as he watched it disappear. He imagined the people inside, leaning back in cushy seats, sipping sodas, not a care in the world. His world, on the other hand, was a lot more cramped. He had a mother back home, tired and overwhelmed. He had bills to think about, things to pay for, things he shouldn't have to think about at 13 years old. Tommy arrived at a corner where another set of cans was piled up. He bent down to pick them, trying to shake off the sense of unease that was beginning to settle in his chest. He'd overheard his mom talking to someone on the phone last night, her voice cracking. She was behind on rent. He didn't know how much, but he knew it was bad. He knew it because his mom kept apologizing to him, kept telling him everything was going to be fine when he hadn't even asked. The screech of a metal gate being opened made him turn his head. A figure moved quickly, sliding into a narrow space between two hangars. Tommy squinted but saw nothing more than a dark figure, someone in a hoodie. He frowned, but decided to ignore it. He picked up another handful of cans, shoving them into the bag. After another half hour of collecting, the bag was heavy, and his back ached. He decided it was time to head home. He slung the bag over his shoulder, grunting under the weight. He walked along the road, keeping his head down as he made his way through the airport's perimeter, the sun still bearing down on him. He arrived at his apartment building, the cracked stucco walls looking the same as always. He trudged up the stairs, the bag banging against the side of his leg. When he reached his door, he paused, hearing muffled voices inside. He took a deep breath and opened it. His mom stood at the kitchen counter, a phone cradled between her shoulder and ear. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she nodded at whatever she was hearing. She turned, her gaze meeting Tommy's, her lips pressed together, her eyes softening. I understand, Mr. Lopez, she said quietly. Please, just give me another week. She turned her back on Tommy, her voice dropping. I'm trying my best. Tommy's stomach tightened. He set the bag down near the door, trying not to make any noise. He watched his mom, her shoulders slumping as she ended the call. She put the phone down slowly, her hands trembling a little. Mom, Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned around, her eyes wet. She wiped them quickly, forcing a smile. Hey, sweetheart, you're back. How was it? Tommy hesitated, his mouth opening, but he didn't know what to say. He shrugged. Same as usual. I got a lot today, though. His mom nodded, her eyes flickering toward the bag. That's good, honey. Every little bit helps. She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved toward the counter, picking up a piece of paper. She held it up, showing it to him. It's an eviction notice, Tommy. We've got a month. They're tired of waiting. Tommy felt his chest tighten, a weight settling right over his heart. He stared at the paper, the bold words standing out. Eviction notice. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. What are we going to do? He asked, his voice cracking just a little. His mom came closer, wrapping her arms around him, pulling him into a hug. We'll figure it out, Tommy. We always do. We just have to keep going, okay? She patted his back, her hand gentle. Tommy closed his eyes, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the scent of cleaning chemicals. He didn't say anything. He didn't want to promise anything he couldn't keep, but deep down, he knew he had to do something. He had to find a way to help, whatever it took. Get some rest, his mom said, pulling back. She gave him a tired smile. Tomorrow's another day, right? He nodded, but inside, the determination was growing. He'd figure something out. Somehow, he'd make things right. The next morning, Tommy woke up earlier than usual. The sun was barely up, and a pale light came through the cracked blinds. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling. His stomach churned, the thought of that eviction notice making sleep impossible. He could hear his mom in the kitchen, moving around quietly, and the soft clink of a spoon against a cup. He got up, rubbing his eyes, and walked into the small kitchen. His mom was sitting at the tiny table, staring at a piece of paper. Her cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her, steam curling up into the air. Morning, Mom, Tommy said, his voice still groggy. She looked up, forcing a smile. Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay? Tommy shrugged. Yeah, I guess. He sat down across from her, glancing at the paper she had in front of her. It was the eviction notice again. You're still thinking about that? He asked, though he knew the answer. She sighed, setting the paper down and resting her hand over it. It's hard not to, Tommy. I just don't know what we're going to do. She looked at him, her eyes tired and red-rimmed. I called Mr. Lopez again last night. He said we're out of time. He gave us a month. That's it. Tommy swallowed, the words hitting him like a punch. A month. He thought of their small apartment, the place where they'd lived since before he could remember. Everything they owned was here. The memories, good and bad. And in just 30 days, they could lose it all. He could see the fear in his mom's eyes, and it made his chest hurt. We'll figure it out, he said, trying to sound confident. He reached for her hand, giving it a squeeze. We have to. She nodded, blinking quickly. You're right. We have to keep going. She stood up, brushing her hands down her sides. I'm going to see if I can pick up an extra cleaning job today. Every dollar helps. Just Take care of yourself, okay, Tommy? Yeah, I will, he said. He watched her grab her bag and head out the door, her shoulders slumped. He wanted to do more. He had to do more. After his mom left, Tommy grabbed the bag of cans from the corner of the room and headed out. It was still early and the streets were quiet. He walked quickly, his sneakers slapping against the pavement, heading for the same stretch of the airport where he usually collected cans. He wasn't even sure what he was hoping to find, but maybe, just maybe, something could change. Something had to change. When he arrived, he noticed a different guard on duty today, a younger guy who didn't seem to pay much attention to him. That was a relief. Tommy moved along the fence, the roar of engines in the background as another private jet took off. He glanced up, watching as the plane lifted smoothly into the sky. How do they do it? Tommy muttered to himself, shaking his head. How can they just go anywhere? He kicked at a can on the ground and then picked it up, shoving it into his bag. His mind wandered back to the night before, the look on his mom's face as she talked to the landlord. She'd sounded so desperate, so tired. Tommy hated it. He hated feeling powerless. He worked his way around the airport perimeter, his bag getting heavier. He glanced at the private jets lined up neatly, the workers buzzing around them, getting them ready for the next set of rich travelers. As he walked, his eyes caught something strange, a man, dressed in dark clothes, moving near one of the smaller jets. The man was hunched over, messing with something near the wing. Tommy slowed his steps, frowning. The guy kept glancing around, acting like he didn't want anyone to see him. Tommy's stomach tightened. Something about it felt wrong. He watched as the man moved to the other side of the jet, his head constantly on a swivel. It wasn't normal behavior. Tommy knew what the workers here looked like, and this guy wasn't wearing any uniform. His heart started to race a little. He didn't know what to do. Should he say something? But who'd listen to him? He watched a bit longer, then noticed the man pull out something that looked like a tool, unscrewing a small panel on the side of the jet. Tommy's mouth went dry. He had to tell someone, right? But the guard from yesterday flashed through his mind, the irritation, the suspicion. They wouldn't believe him. They'd think he was causing trouble. Tommy took a step back, unsure. He needed to think. He could hear people chatting from a nearby hangar, but they weren't looking in his direction. He weighed his options. Try to tell someone and risk getting in trouble, or ignore it and hope it was nothing. He glanced back at the man, who had now ducked further under the jet, completely hidden from sight. Tommy's head spun with questions. What was the guy doing? And why was he acting so secretive? Tommy knew he couldn't just walk away, not if something bad was about to happen. But what could he do? Suddenly, Tommy heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, seeing one of the airport workers coming his way, holding a clipboard. The man looked tired, yawning as he walked. Tommy's mind raced. He couldn't just let this go. "Hey!" Tommy called, taking a step toward the worker. The man glanced up, frowning. "What?" the worker said, his voice rough. "There's a guy over there," Tommy said, pointing toward the jet. "He's messing with that plane. I don't think he's supposed to be there." The worker raised an eyebrow, then looked over toward where Tommy was pointing. He squinted, then shrugged. "Probably just maintenance. Go on, kid. Don't hang around here." Tommy felt his frustration boil. "I'm serious," he said louder this time. "He's sneaking around. He doesn't look like he's supposed to be there." The worker rolled his eyes. "Look, kid, this isn't your business, all right? Go home before I call security." Tommy clenched his teeth, feeling his face grow hot. He looked back toward the jet, but the man in dark clothes was gone. He cursed under his breath. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it really was just maintenance, but something told him it wasn't. Tommy walked away, his heart pounding, his thoughts tangled. He'd tried. He'd done what he could, but no one wanted to listen to some kid. He kicked at a rock as he moved along, frustrated. He wished his dad were here. His dad would know what to do. But then he remembered. His dad wasn't here, and he hadn't been for years. It was just him and his mom, and he had to figure it out himself. By the time Tommy made it back to the apartment, the sun was higher in the sky, and the heat was getting worse. He opened the door, dropping his bag of cans by the entrance. His mom wasn't home yet. He sat down at the small table, resting his head in his hands. He needed a plan. He needed to do something more, something big. His mom's voice echoed in his head. "We have to keep going." She always said that like a broken record. But how? How could they keep going when everything seemed so stacked against them? Tommy closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Suddenly, an idea formed in his mind. Crazy, reckless, but it was something. He stood up, looking at the eviction notice still lying on the counter. If no one else would listen, then he'd make them listen. He was going to the airport again tomorrow, and he'd figure out how to get someone's attention. This wasn't over yet. The sun was high and burning bright when Tommy made his way to the airport the next afternoon. He had barely slept, his mind turning over and over about what he'd seen. There was no way that guy was supposed to be there, and no one seemed to care. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't just let it go. As he walked along the road toward the airport fence, Tommy could see the usual stream of workers and guards, each one moving through their own routine. He held his bag of cans loosely by his side, using it as his excuse to be there again. He needed to stay out of sight, but he also needed to keep an eye on the jets, especially the one that had been tampered with yesterday. Tommy rounded a corner and came to the same spot as the day before. He crouched near a pile of old cans, pretending to pick through them while keeping his eyes on the row of jets. He scanned the area, trying to spot anything unusual. After a few minutes, his eyes narrowed. There he was again, the man in the dark clothes. He was crouched next to the same jet, this time messing with something near the landing gear. Tommy's heart began to pound in his chest, his throat tightening. The guy was definitely up to something. He needed to tell someone, but how could he make them believe him? As Tommy watched, he saw a group of people walking toward the jet. There was a man in a sharp suit, tall and confident, flanked by a few other people who looked like assistants or maybe security. Tommy figured the guy in the suit must be important, maybe the owner of the jet. Tommy's pulse quickened. The man was going to get on that plane, and he had no idea what had been done to it. Tommy knew this was his chance. He couldn't afford to hold back. He took a deep breath, then stood up, dropping his bag of cans. He started walking quickly toward the group, his eyes locked on the man in the suit. As he moved, he noticed two security guards turning toward him, their expressions immediately hardening. They must have recognized him from the day before. "Hey, you there!" one of the guards called, starting toward him. Tommy didn't stop. He kept moving, his eyes on the group near the jet. The man in the suit was talking to someone, smiling, unaware. Tommy's chest tightened. He had to do something. "Hey!" the guard shouted again, louder this time. Tommy could hear the heavy footsteps behind him, but he ignored them. He broke into a run, heading straight for the jet. "Don't get on that plane," Tommy shouted, his voice cracking. "It's been sabotaged. Don't get on." The man in the suit turned, his face puzzled, his eyebrows pulling together. Tommy kept running, waving his arms. "Please, you've got to listen," he yelled, his voice desperate. The guards were on him in an instant, grabbing his arms, pulling him back. Tommy struggled, trying to break free, but their grip was too strong. "Let me go!" he shouted, kicking out. "You don't understand. The plane isn't safe." The man in the suit took a step forward, looking between Tommy and the guards. He held up a hand, his expression changing from confusion to something else. Curiosity, maybe. "Wait," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "Let the boy speak." The guards hesitated, their grips loosening slightly. Tommy took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "I saw someone messing with your plane," Tommy said, his eyes wide, pleading. "Yesterday and today. He was doing something under the wing near the fuel tank. I don't think it's safe. You have to check it out." The man in the suit looked at Tommy for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. Then he turned, glancing over at one of his assistants. "Call maintenance," he said, his tone serious now. "Have them check everything, thoroughly." The assistant nodded, quickly pulling out a phone. The guards still held Tommy, but their grip had loosened more. The man in the suit stepped closer, looking Tommy over, his eyes sharp. "What's your name, kid?" he asked. "Tommy," he replied, swallowing hard. His heart was still racing, adrenaline making his hands shake. "Well, Tommy," the man said, glancing back at the jet, "I hope for your sake that you're telling the truth." Tommy nodded, his throat dry. "I am. I swear." The next few minutes were a blur. Maintenance workers arrived, swarming the jet, opening panels, checking every inch. Tommy watched, his breath caught in his chest. What if he was wrong? What if he had just made everything worse? He could feel the guards watching him, their expressions unreadable. Then, one of the workers shouted, his voice carrying across the tarmac, "Hey, over here! There's something wrong with the fuel line!" Tommy felt his knees go weak with relief. He hadn't been wrong. The worker waved over another man, pointing at a section of the plane. They both examined it, their faces serious. One of them turned, giving a thumbs up to the man in the suit. The man looked back at Tommy, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, kid," he said, his voice softer now. "Looks like you might have just saved my life." Tommy felt his face flush, a mix of relief and pride swelling in his chest. He glanced at the guards, who finally let go of his arms, stepping back. Tommy rubbed his wrists, looking up at the man. I didn't want anyone to get hurt," Tommy said, his voice quiet. The man nodded, then gestured for his assistants to come over. He spoke to them quietly for a moment before turning back to Tommy. "You did a brave thing, Tommy," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." Tommy shifted on his feet, unsure of what to say. He had acted on instinct, on the fear that someone might get hurt. He hadn't thought about being brave or anything like that. "What's going to happen now?" Tommy asked, glancing over at the jet, where the workers were still inspecting the damage. The man in the suit followed his gaze, his expression darkening. "We're going to find out who did this, and they're not getting away with it." Tommy nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction. Whoever that guy was, he wasn't going to get away with it. Not if this man had anything to say about it. The man turned back to Tommy, giving him a thoughtful look. "Where do you live, Tommy? Are your parents around?" Tommy hesitated, then shook his head. "It's just me and my mom. We live a few blocks from here." The man nodded, seeming to think for a moment. Then he pulled out a small business card, handing it to Tommy. "Take this," he said. "I want you to call me tomorrow. We'll see if there's something I can do to help you out." Tommy took the card, staring at it for a moment before looking back up. "Really?" The man smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Really? You did something good today, Tommy, and good things should come from that." Tommy felt his chest swell, a lump forming in his throat. He nodded, holding the card tightly in his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The man gave him a final nod before turning to speak with his assistants, his tone serious as they moved away toward the hangar. The guards had stepped back, no longer interested in Tommy, their attention now focused on the commotion around the jet. Tommy took a deep breath, his legs feeling shaky as he turned and started walking away. He couldn't believe it. He'd done it. He'd actually made a difference. And maybe, just maybe, things were going to change for him and his mom. He walked back toward the main road, the business card still clutched in his hand. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the heat was finally beginning to let up. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, Tommy felt hopeful. The next day, Tommy woke up feeling a mixture of nerves and hope. The business card sat on the table next to his bed, the name Mr. Thompson printed in bold letters. Tommy picked it up, rubbing his thumb over the embossed name. He had never met anyone like Mr. Thompson before, a person who actually listened, someone with the power to change things. Today, Tommy planned to make that call. He glanced over at his mom, still asleep on the couch, her face relaxed for the first time in days. He didn't want to wake her, not yet. She needed the rest. Tommy quietly slipped on his sneakers, grabbed his usual bag, and decided to head back to the airport. He wanted to see if there was any fallout from yesterday, to make sure everything was all right. The air outside was cool in the early morning, the sky painted in soft blues and pinks. Tommy walked the familiar route to the airport, his feet moving on autopilot. As he neared the perimeter fence, he saw a few security guards standing together, talking, their expressions serious. Tommy stayed back, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He moved along the fence, his eyes scanning the line of jets. It all looked calm now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then he spotted him, the same man from before, the one who had tampered with the jet. He was there again, walking near another plane, his face hidden beneath the brim of a cap. Tommy's heart skipped a beat, his stomach tightening. What was this guy doing here again? Tommy ducked down, moving slowly along the edge of a hangar, trying to keep the man in sight. He had to figure out what was going on. Tommy watched as the man approached a smaller jet, his movements careful, calculated. Tommy's heart pounded in his ears. He knew he had to do something, and this time he couldn't afford for anyone to brush him off. He had to make them listen, no matter what it took. Suddenly, Tommy saw a familiar figure walking toward the jet, Mr. Thompson. He was talking to someone, looking relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. Tommy's stomach dropped. He couldn't let Mr. Thompson get on that plane. He had saved him once, and he wasn't going to let anything happen now. Without thinking, Tommy took off running, his feet slapping hard against the asphalt. He could hear the guards shouting behind him, but he didn't stop. He sprinted toward Mr. Thompson, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Mr. Thompson!" Tommy shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Wait! Please wait!" Mr. Thompson turned, his face registering surprise as he saw Tommy running toward him. The security guards were close behind, their radios crackling with hurried voices. Tommy didn't have much time. "Stop!" he yelled again, his legs burning as he pushed himself forward. "Don't get on that plane. It's been messed with." Mr. Thompson's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something more serious. He held up a hand, signaling for the guards to stop. They hesitated, glancing between Mr. Thompson and Tommy. Tommy skidded to a stop in front of Mr. Thompson, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. "I saw him," Tommy panted, pointing toward the man in the cap, who was now trying to walk away unnoticed. "The same guy from yesterday. He was messing with your plane again. I swear you can't get on it." Mr. Thompson frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked in the direction Tommy was pointing. He turned to one of his assistants, giving a quick nod. "Get the maintenance team out here now, and you—" He gestured to the guards. "Find that man." The guards took off, their radios buzzing as they ran toward the figure who was now trying to disappear into the hangars. Tommy watched, his heart still pounding, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. Mr. Thompson turned back to Tommy, his face a mixture of concern and something else. Gratitude, maybe. "Tommy," Mr. Thompson said, his voice steady, "you did the right thing, again. I don't know how you keep finding yourself in the middle of this, but I'm glad you do." Tommy swallowed, trying to catch his breath. I knew something was wrong. I had to tell you." Mr. Thompson nodded, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You might have just saved more lives than you know, kid." He looked over at the maintenance crew, who were now swarming around the jet, checking every inch with urgent precision. Tommy felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. His legs felt weak, his muscles aching from the sprint. He had done it, again. But there was still something gnawing at him, a question that wouldn't go away. "Why would someone do this?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would someone try to hurt you like this?" Mr. Thompson's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the jet. "I don't know, Tommy, but I promise you we're going to find out. Whoever is behind this won't get away with it." Tommy nodded, a chill running down his spine. He believed Mr. Thompson, but he also knew that this was far from over. There was something bigger going on, something that scared him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Just then, the guards returned, holding the man in the cap between them. His face was flushed, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man. "Who are you?" Mr. Thompson demanded, his voice cold. "Why are you doing this?" The man didn't answer, his lips pressed tightly together. One of the guards shook him roughly, but he just stared at the ground, refusing to speak. Tommy watched, his stomach twisting. He could see the fear in the man's eyes, but there was something else there too. Something like defiance. It made Tommy uneasy. This wasn't just some random act. There was a reason behind it, and Tommy had a feeling it wasn't a good one. Mr. Thompson sighed, then gestured to the guards. "Take him away. We'll let the authorities handle this." The guards nodded, dragging the man away toward one of the hangars. Mr. Thompson turned back to Tommy, his expression softening. "You've done more than enough, Tommy," he said, his voice kind. "But I want you to stay safe, okay? This isn't your fight." Tommy nodded, but he knew it wasn't that simple. He couldn't just walk away, not now. He had gotten involved, and now he had to see it through. Mr. Thompson seemed to sense Tommy's hesitation. He gave a small smile, then pulled out his phone. "Listen, Tommy, I want to help you and your mom. I want you to call me later today. We'll set something up, all right?" Tommy took a deep breath, then nodded. "Okay, I will." Mr. Thompson patted Tommy on the shoulder again, then turned and walked away, his assistants following closely behind. Tommy watched them go, his mind still spinning. He had done what he needed to do, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He turned and started walking back toward the main road, his feet heavy, his body exhausted. The sun was climbing higher now, the heat beginning to settle in. Tommy reached into his pocket, pulling out the business card Mr. Thompson had given him. He looked at it, then slipped it back into his pocket. He had a call to make. But first, he needed to get home. He walked the rest of the way in silence, his mind replaying everything that had happened. The man in the cap, Mr. Thompson's words, the look in the man's eyes. It all swirled together in his head, a mess of emotions and thoughts that he couldn't quite untangle. When he reached his apartment, he opened the door quietly, not wanting to wake his mom if she was still asleep. But she wasn't on the couch. Instead, she was in the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Tommy," she said, her voice filled with relief. "I was so worried. Where have you been?" Tommy walked over, giving her a hug, the tension in his chest finally loosening a little. "I had to do something, Mom, but it's okay now. Everything's gonna be okay." She pulled back, looking at him, her eyes filled with questions. "What do you mean? What happened?" Tommy took a deep breath, then pulled out the business card, showing it to her. "I met someone who wants to help us. I think things are gonna change for us, Mom." She stared at the card, her eyes wide, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. "Tommy, is this real?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it's real. I'm gonna call him later today. We're gonna be okay, Mom. I promise." She hugged him again, her arms tight around him, her body trembling. Tommy closed his eyes, holding on to her, feeling the hope finally take root. Things were changing, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. Later that afternoon, Tommy sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone. The business card was in front of him, Mr. Thompson's name practically jumping off the glossy surface. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling as he picked up the phone and dialed the number. His mum sat across from him, her eyes wide, her lips pressed together in a nervous smile. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. Tommy's heart pounded as a voice picked up on the other end. "Hello?" It was Mr. Thompson. Hi, Mr. Thompson, it's Tommy," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You told me to call." There was a pause, then Mr. Thompson's voice softened. "Tommy, good to hear from you, son. I'm glad you called. How are you and your mom doing?" Tommy glanced over at his mom. She was watching him, her eyes filled with hope. We're okay. But, I wanted to talk to you about what you said yesterday, about helping us." Mr. Thompson's voice brightened. "Of course, Tommy. You've done a great thing for me, and I'm serious about helping you out. Why don't you come by my office tomorrow? Bring your mom if you can. I think we can figure something out." Tommy's heart skipped a beat, a sense of disbelief washing over him. "Really? You mean it?" "I do, Tommy. I want to meet you both. I think there's a lot we can talk about." Tommy nodded, even though Mr. Thompson couldn't see him. "Okay, we'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Really, thank you." "It's my pleasure, Tommy. I'll see you tomorrow, all right? You take care until then." "Yeah, you too," Tommy said, his voice filled with gratitude. He hung up, his hands still shaking. He looked over at his mom, who was staring at him, her eyes wide. "Well?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommy smiled, his eyes shining. "He wants us to go to his office tomorrow. He said he wants to help us." His mom's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. She let out a shaky breath, then pulled Tommy into a hug, holding him tight. "Oh, Tommy, I can't believe this. I'm so proud of you." Tommy closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel scared. Things were finally starting to look up. The next morning, Tommy and his mom stood outside a tall glass building in Manhattan. Tommy looked up, the massive structure seeming to reach all the way to the sky. He felt small, but in a different way from before. This time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be a part of something bigger. His mom squeezed his hand, her eyes wide with awe. "I've never been to a place like this," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Me neither," Tommy admitted. He looked at the business card again, double-checking the address. "This is it. Let's go in." They walked through the large glass doors, the cool air inside hitting them instantly. The lobby was grand, with shiny floors and a tall ceiling. People moved back and forth, dressed in suits, their footsteps echoing. Tommy led his mom to the reception desk, where a woman with a friendly smile greeted them. "Hi, we're here to see Mr. Thompson," Tommy said, his voice surprisingly steady. "He's expecting us." The receptionist looked at her screen, then smiled at them. "Of course, you must be Tommy. Mr. Thompson's office is on the 15th floor. You can take the elevator right over there." Tommy nodded, thanking her, and then led his mom to the elevators. His mom's hand was still trembling slightly, and he gave her a reassuring smile as they stepped inside. He could feel her anxiety. This was all so new, so different. But it was exciting too. They were finally being given a chance. When they reached the 15th floor, they were greeted by another assistant who led them down a plush hallway to a large wooden door. The assistant knocked once, then opened it, gesturing for them to enter. Mr. Thompson was standing by the window, his back to them. When they walked in, he turned, a warm smile spreading across his face. He was dressed in another sharp suit, his presence commanding. He walked over, extending his hand to Tommy's mom. "You must be Tommy's mother. It's a pleasure to meet you," he said, his voice smooth and confident. She took his hand, her voice a little shaky. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for seeing us." Mr. Thompson nodded, then turned to Tommy, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "And Tommy, good to see you again. Come, have a seat, both of you." They sat down in front of his large desk, the room filled with the soft hum of the city outside. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to meet you both because, quite frankly, I owe you, Tommy. You did something incredible, something that most people wouldn't have had the courage to do. And I believe that people who do good deserve good in return," he said, his voice sincere. Tommy shifted in his seat, his face flushing. I couldn't let something bad happen." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes filled with approval. "And that's exactly why I want to help. Tommy, your mom told me a little about your situation. I understand things have been tough. I want to offer your mom a job, a stable job, here in Manhattan. And I also want to make sure you two don't have to worry about your rent anymore." Tommy's mom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Mr. Thompson, I don't know what to say." Mr. Thompson smiled gently. "Just say yes. I want to help, and I have the means to do it. You've raised an incredible young man, and you deserve a chance to breathe a little easier." Tommy looked at his mom, her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. She nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. Yes, of course. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you so much." Tommy felt a weight lift off his chest, a feeling of pure relief washing over him. He looked at Mr. Thompson, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I don't know how we could ever repay you." Mr. Thompson waved a hand dismissively. "There's no need for repayment, Tommy. You've already done enough for me. Just take this opportunity and make the most of it. I have no doubt you both will." He stood, extending his hand to Tommy, then to his mom. "Welcome to a new chapter in your lives," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Tommy stood, shaking Mr. Thompson's hand, his chest filled with emotions he couldn't quite describe. His mom did the same, her eyes still glistening with tears. They walked out of the office, their steps light, the weight that had been pressing down on them for so long finally beginning to lift. As they stepped back into the elevator, Tommy's mom looked at him, her eyes filled with love and pride. "Tommy, you've changed our lives," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how I got so lucky to have you." Tommy smiled, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "We did this together, Mom. We're a team." She pulled him into a hug, holding him close as the elevator descended. Tommy closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of his mom's perfume, the world around them finally starting to feel right. They walked out of the building into the bright Manhattan sun, the city buzzing with life around them. Tommy looked at his mom, a smile breaking across his face. "How about we go get some lunch?" he asked, his voice light. His mom laughed, a sound that made Tommy's heart swell. "That sounds perfect," she said, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. They walked down the busy street, their steps in sync, the future suddenly full of possibilities. The next few days were a whirlwind of change for Tommy and his mom. It was as if the entire world had shifted, opening new doors that they'd never imagined. Mr. Thompson's promise wasn't just words. His assistants had called, arranging for Tommy's mom to start her new job immediately. The eviction notice that had hung over them like a dark cloud was taken care of. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe. Tommy still found it hard to believe, like he was waiting to wake up from a dream. Each morning, he would open his eyes and have to remind himself that everything was real, that they were going to be okay. His mom looked happier than he'd seen her in years. The lines of worry that had etched themselves into her face had softened. Her eyes were brighter, her laugh more frequent. On a cool, sunny morning, they received a surprise knock on the door. Tommy's mom, wearing a freshly ironed blouse for her new job, rushed to answer it, her eyes widening as she saw who stood there. Mr. Thompson, in another sharp suit, smiled at her, a small team of assistants behind him. "Mr. Thompson," she gasped, her voice filled with shock. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. "I came to check in on Tommy, and of course to see how you're doing as well. May we come in?" Tommy's mom stepped aside quickly, her hands shaking slightly. "Yes, of course, come in, come in." Tommy, hearing voices, came out of his small bedroom, his eyes widening as he spotted Mr. Thompson standing in their living room. He straightened, his heart pounding. "Mr. Thompson!" Mr. Thompson turned, smiling at Tommy. "There he is, the young man who saved my life," he said, his voice full of warmth. He glanced around the apartment, taking in the worn-out furniture and the small, cozy details. "I wanted to come by and thank you properly, Tommy. You did something remarkable, not once, but twice." Tommy looked down, feeling his face grow warm. "I just did what anyone would do," he mumbled. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, Tommy, most people wouldn't have done what you did. It takes courage to speak up, especially when no one wants to listen." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to Tommy's mom, who took it with trembling hands. "What's this?" she asked, her voice shaky. Mr. Thompson smiled gently. "A little something to help you get settled. You and Tommy deserve a fresh start, and I want to make sure you have everything you need." Tommy's mom opened the envelope, her eyes widening at the sight of the check inside. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, only a choked sob. She looked up at Mr. Thompson, tears welling in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, this is too much. I can't accept this." Mr. Thompson shook his head firmly. "It's not too much, and you can accept it. You've raised an incredible young man, and it's my privilege to help you both. Besides, I owe my life to your son. The least I can do is make sure you're both taken care of." Tommy's mom covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Mr. Thompson smiled, then turned to Tommy, his eyes softening. "And Tommy, I wanted to talk to you about something else. I have some friends who work in aviation. They help train young people who are interested in learning about planes and how they work. I was thinking, if you're interested, I could arrange for you to visit one of their facilities. Maybe learn a bit about what they do." Tommy's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. "You mean I could learn about planes? Like actually work with them?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his smile widening. "Exactly. You seem to have an eye for detail, and you're clearly passionate about helping others. I think you'd do well there. And who knows, maybe this could be the start of something bigger for you." Tommy felt his chest swell, a mix of excitement and disbelief coursing through him. He had always watched the planes at the airport, wondering what it was like to be part of that world. Now, the idea that he could actually learn about them, be part of it, was almost too much to comprehend. I'd love that, Mr. Thompson, Tommy said, his voice cracking slightly. Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Thompson reached out, giving Tommy's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. You've earned it, Tommy, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you accomplish. Tommy's mom stepped forward, her hand resting on Tommy's shoulder, her eyes still wet with tears. You've given us so much hope, Mr. Thompson. We'll never forget this. Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. Hope is something everyone deserves, and you two have more than earned it. He turned to his assistants, nodding. We'll be in touch about the arrangements, but for now, I just wanted to come by and see you both. Tommy's mom nodded, her voice still trembling. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Mr. Thompson nodded, giving them both a final smile before turning to leave. Tommy and his mom walked him to the door, watching as he and his team made their way down the hallway. Once the door closed, Tommy's mom turned to him, her eyes wide, her face flushed. Tommy, can you believe this? She whispered, her voice filled with awe. We're finally getting a chance. Tommy nodded, a smile breaking across his face. Yeah, Mom, we really are. He looked down at the envelope in her hand, the weight of what it meant settling in. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living. They had a future now, and it was filled with possibilities. Later that day, Tommy sat in his room, staring out the window at the sky above. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. He could hear his mom humming softly in the kitchen, the sound of pots and pans clinking as she prepared dinner. It felt like a dream, one he never wanted to wake up from. He thought about the man who had tried to sabotage the plane, about the fear he'd felt as he'd run across the tarmac. It had been terrifying, but he knew now that it had all been worth it. Every moment of doubt, every struggle, they had all led to this. Tommy heard a knock on his bedroom door, and his mum peeked her head in, her smile bright. Dinner's ready, sweetheart. Come on out. Tommy nodded, standing up and following her to the kitchen. The table was set, the aroma of a home-cooked meal filling the small space. His mum gestured for him to sit, then placed a plate in front of him, her eyes twinkling. I made your favorite, she said, her voice soft. We have something to celebrate tonight, don't we? Tommy smiled, looking down at the plate of spaghetti, the sauce steaming. He picked up his fork, his heart swelling with love for his mom. Yeah, we do, he said, his voice filled with emotion. We really do. They ate in silence for a few moments, the only sound the clinking of their forks against their plates. Then his mom spoke, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Tommy, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always been so strong, so brave. And now, look at what you've done. You've changed our lives. Tommy looked up, his eyes meeting hers, his chest tightening. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You've always been there for me. I just wanted to make things better for us. His mom reached across the table, taking his hand in hers, her eyes glistening. And you did, sweetheart. You did more than I ever could have imagined. Tommy squeezed her hand, his throat tight. He looked out the window, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It seemed bright, full of promise, and Tommy knew that no matter what came next, he and his mom would face it together. As they finished their meal, his mom stood, clearing the plates and humming softly to herself. Tommy watched her, a smile tugging at his lips. It felt like everything had shifted, like the world was finally right. He had done something good, something that mattered, and now they had a chance to start over. Tommy got up, helping his mom clear the table, their movements in sync. They washed the dishes together, the warm water running over their hands, the sound of laughter filling the small kitchen. It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. When they were done, his mom turned to him, her smile bright. "How about we watch a movie?" she asked. "It's been a while since we had a movie night." Tommy grinned, nodding. "Yeah, I'd like that." They settled onto the couch, a blanket spread over their laps, the TV flickering to life. As the opening credits rolled, Tommy leaned back, his mom resting her head on his shoulder. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the moment wash over him. This was what he had fought for, this feeling of peace, of safety. And he knew deep in his heart that no matter what came next, they were ready for it. The next morning, Tommy awoke to the sound of a knock at the door. It was a steady, firm knock, different from the gentle taps of their neighbors. He rubbed his eyes, rolling out of bed as his mom rushed past his door, tying her robe around her waist. "Who could it be this early?" she muttered, her voice filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. Tommy followed her out of his room, standing at the edge of the hallway as she opened the door. Standing in the hallway was Mr. Thompson, his suit crisp and his smile as polished as ever. Behind him, two assistants held small gift bags, their expressions friendly but professional. Tommy's mom's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. "Mr. Thompson," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "What a surprise." Mr. Thompson smiled, his eyes warm as he took a step inside. "Good morning. I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, but I wanted to come by to share some good news, and of course to see how you both are doing." He looked past her, spotting Tommy in the hallway. "Morning, Tommy." Tommy stepped forward, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Morning, Mr. Thompson." Mr. Thompson nodded, then gestured for his assistants to step forward. They handed the gift bags to Tommy's mom, who took them gingerly, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Mr. Thompson smiled. "A little something for you both. Just a few items to help make things easier. A bit of comfort after everything you've been through." He glanced at Tommy, his eyes softening. "And I have something special for you, Tommy." Tommy's mom opened one of the bags, her eyes widening as she pulled out a neatly folded winter coat. She looked at Mr. Thompson, her lips trembling. "Mr. Thompson, you've already done so much. We couldn't possibly—" Mr. Thompson held up a hand, his expression gentle. "Please, think of it as a small gesture. You've both been through enough hardships. It's time for some comfort." Tommy's mom nodded, her eyes misting over. "Thank you. I don't know how we could ever repay you." Mr. Thompson smiled, then turned to Tommy, his expression brightening. "Tommy, I wanted to talk to you about something important. I mentioned before that I have friends in the aviation field, and I spoke to them about you. They're very interested in meeting you." Tommy's heart leapt in his chest. "Meeting me? You mean I could actually learn about planes?" Mr. Thompson nodded, a twinkle in his eye. "Exactly. They have an introductory program for young people like you, those with a passion and the courage to follow it. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Tommy's mom looked at Tommy, her eyes wide with pride. "Oh, Tommy, that's wonderful." Tommy swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his ears. "I'd love to, Mr. Thompson. I really would." Mr. Thompson smiled, patting Tommy on the shoulder. "I thought you might. I've arranged for you to visit their training facility next week. It's a great opportunity, Tommy, one that I know you'll make the most of." Tommy nodded, barely able to speak. His mom reached over, wrapping her arm around his shoulders, her eyes filled with emotion. "This is amazing, Tommy. You're going to do great things." Tommy looked at Mr. Thompson, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Thompson nodded. You deserve it, Tommy. You've proven yourself to be brave, determined, and capable. I have no doubt you'll go far. He glanced at his assistants, then back at Tommy and his mom. Well, I won't take up any more of your time this morning. I just wanted to come by and share the good news in person. Tommy's mom stepped forward, her voice trembling. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, for everything. You've changed our lives. Mr. Thompson gave a small smile, his eyes softening. You both deserve this. It's been my pleasure to help. He turned, nodding to his assistants, and they all made their way back toward the door. Mr. Thompson paused before leaving, looking at Tommy once more. I'll see you soon, Tommy. Be ready for some exciting times ahead. Tommy nodded, his heart swelling with anticipation. I will. I'll be ready. With that, Mr. Thompson and his team left, the door clicking shut behind them. Tommy's mom stood in the middle of the living room, her hands still trembling as she looked down at the gift bags. She let out a shaky breath, then turned to Tommy, her eyes filled with tears. Tommy, it's like a miracle, she whispered. I can't believe how much everything has changed. Tommy nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked at his mom, her face filled with hope, her smile brighter than he'd seen in years. It felt like all of the struggles, all of the pain and uncertainty, they were finally behind them. For the first time in so long, Tommy felt like everything was going to be okay. Later that day, Tommy sat on the steps outside their building, watching as people went about their day. Cars drove by, people walked with purpose, and the world seemed brighter somehow. He still had Mr. Thompson's business card in his pocket, and he ran his fingers over it, feeling the smooth surface. He couldn't wait for next week, for the chance to see the aviation facility and learn more about the world of planes. It felt like a new door had opened, a door to a future he had never dared to dream of. He heard the door behind him creak open, and his mom stepped out, her smile still lingering. She sat down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Tommy, do you remember how I used to say that we had to keep going even when things were tough? She asked, her voice soft. Tommy nodded. Yeah, I remember. His mom looked out at the street, her eyes distant. I used to say it to convince myself, you know. I wasn't always sure we'd make it, but I couldn't let myself stop hoping. And now look at where we are. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. You gave us a reason to keep going, Tommy. You made this happen. Tommy swallowed hard, his chest tightening. I didn't want to give up, not on us. His mom smiled, pulling him into a hug, her arms wrapped tightly around him. And you didn't. Because of you, we're getting a new start. Tommy hugged her back, closing his eyes, letting himself feel the weight of her words. It was true. He had pushed forward, even when things seemed impossible. And now, they were standing on the edge of something new, something filled with hope and promise. They sat together on the steps for a while longer, watching as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The air was cool, and Tommy felt a sense of peace settle over him. Everything felt different now, like the world had opened up in ways he had never thought possible. Are you nervous about next week? His mom asked, her voice gentle. Tommy nodded slowly. A little, yeah, but I'm excited too. It's like everything I've ever wanted, and I don't want to mess it up. His mom squeezed his shoulder. You won't, sweetheart. You've got this. You've already done so much. You saved a life. This is just the beginning. Tommy smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle deep inside him. He looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in soft oranges and pinks. It really did feel like the beginning, like anything was possible. The following days passed in a blur of preparations and excitement. Tommy and his mom spent time making sure everything was ready. His mom's new job, their new lease on life. The envelope Mr. Thompson had given them allowed them to catch up on bills, buy some groceries, and even get a few things they needed for their home. Finally, the day arrived. Tommy found himself standing in front of a building that was unlike any he had ever seen. It was a hangar, large and open, filled with planes in various states of maintenance. His heart pounded as he looked up at it, a sense of awe washing over him. Mr. Thompson's contact, a kind man named Steve, greeted him at the entrance. Steve was older, with kind eyes and a weathered face. He shook Tommy's hand firmly, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Tommy, it's great to meet you," Steve said, his voice rough but friendly. "Mr. Thompson told me all about you. Sounds like you've got a good head on your shoulders." Tommy smiled nervously. "Thanks. I'm really excited to be here." Steve nodded, then gestured for Tommy to follow him inside. As they walked, Steve began explaining the different parts of the hangar, what they did, how things worked. Tommy listened, his eyes wide, his heart pounding with excitement. It felt like he was stepping into a different world, a world he had always watched from the outside but had never imagined being part of. They approached a small group of people, all dressed in coveralls, working on the wing of a small plane. Steve introduced Tommy to each of them, and they greeted him warmly, their hands covered in oil and grime. Tommy felt a surge of excitement as he shook their hands. These people were real. They were doing the work he had always dreamed of. "Today, we're going to show you some basics," Steve said, leading Tommy over to a workbench. "It's important to understand how everything fits together, how each part plays a role. You ready to get your hands a little dirty?" Tommy grinned, nodding. "Yeah, I'm ready." Steve handed him a pair of gloves and Tommy pulled them on, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked down at the workbench, the tools laid out in front of him, and he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This was where he belonged. Here, learning, working, being part of something bigger. As the day went on, Tommy found himself lost in the work. He learned about the different parts of the plane, how to check for issues, how to make sure everything was running smoothly. The people around him were patient, kind, explaining things in a way that made sense, their passion for the work clear. By the time the sun began to set, Tommy was covered in grease and grime, his muscles sore, but he had never felt happier. Steve clapped him on the back, a proud smile on his face. "You did good today, kid," Steve said. "I think you've got a real knack for this." Tommy smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Thanks, Steve. It was amazing." Steve nodded, then gestured toward the hangar doors. "Go on, head home. You deserve some rest, but come back soon, all right? We could use someone like you around here." Tommy nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. He looked around the hangar one last time, taking it all in, then headed for the door. He stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting his face, the sky painted in shades of purple and blue. As he walked away, he felt a sense of hope, unlike anything he had ever felt before. This was his future, something real, something to build on. And he knew deep in his heart that this was only the beginning. The days following Tommy's first visit to the aviation hangar were like a dream. It felt like his life had switched gears, moving from a struggle to survive into something different, something better. The grime on his hands no longer came from picking cans out of the garbage, but from working with his hands, learning things that seemed to bring the future closer, make it more tangible. Tommy had found purpose. On this particular day, Tommy and his mom were getting ready to move. It wasn't a big move, just a few streets over to a larger apartment, but the significance of it was immense. No longer would they live under the fear of eviction. No longer would Tommy watch his mom anxiously count crumpled bills at the kitchen table. His mom stood in their old living room, looking at the last of the boxes stacked against the wall. She let out a deep sigh, turning to Tommy with a smile that looked like relief. "Tommy, are you ready to take this stuff over?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. Tommy nodded, stepping forward and grabbing the handle of one of the heavier boxes. "Yeah, let's get it done." He looked around at the place they had called home for so long, the worn-out carpet, the old couch that had seen better days, the walls that held too many memories of hard times. He could feel a strange mix of sadness and excitement churning inside of him. His mum gave him a warm smile, her eyes soft. "You know, I never thought we'd get out of here. I thought we'd be stuck forever." Tommy looked at her, his hands tightening around the box. "Me too, Mom. But now we're finally getting out. We're finally getting a fresh start." His mom reached over, pulling him into a hug. "You've made all of this possible, Tommy. I hope you know how proud I am of you." Tommy swallowed, hugging her back. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. We're a team, remember?" She nodded, her eyes glistening as she pulled back. "Always." They loaded up the last of the boxes into the back of the small truck that Mr. Thompson had helped them rent for the move. Tommy climbed into the passenger seat while his mum got behind the wheel. As they pulled away from the old apartment building, Tommy looked out the window, watching as the place that had been their home for so long disappeared from view. It felt like leaving a piece of himself behind, a piece that he was ready to let go of. When they arrived at the new apartment, Tommy was surprised by how different everything felt. The building was newer, the paint fresh, and the hallway clean. The air even smelled different, like something new, something promising. Tommy's mom opened the door to their new apartment, and they stepped inside, setting the boxes down in the living room. The place was small but bright, with a window that looked out over a park. The walls were a soft, warm color, and the floor was clean, not like the worn-out carpet they were used to. Tommy looked around, taking it all in. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it felt like hope. Tommy's mom walked over to the window, looking out at the park below. "Look at that, Tommy. We've got a view now," she said, her voice filled with awe. Tommy walked over, standing next to her. He looked out at the green trees, the people walking by, the kids playing on the playground. He smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Yeah, Mom, it's beautiful." His mom turned to him, her eyes filled with pride. "This is our new start, Tommy, and we're going to make the most of it." Tommy nodded, his heart swelling. "Yeah, we really are." A few days later, Tommy found himself back at the aviation hangar, standing in front of a plane with Steve by his side. He had come to love the hangar, the smells of oil and metal, the sound of people working, the way everything seemed to come alive when they were busy fixing things. It felt like home, in a way that nowhere else ever had. "All right, Tommy, today we're going to do something a little different," Steve said, handing Tommy a pair of goggles. "You're going to help me with some of the checks we do before a plane takes off. Think you're up for it?" Tommy took the goggles, his heart pounding with excitement. "Yeah, I'm up for it." Steve grinned, giving Tommy a pat on the back. "That's what I like to hear. Come on, let's get to work." They spent the next few hours going through the plane, checking every part to make sure it was ready for flight. Steve showed Tommy how to test the flaps, how to make sure the fuel lines were clear, how to inspect the landing gear. Tommy listened intently, his hands moving over the parts of the plane with a mixture of nervousness and awe. It was incredible to think that these parts, all of these small, intricate pieces, worked together to make something as huge as a plane fly. As they finished up, Steve turned to Tommy, a proud smile on his face. "You've got a real talent for this, kid. You pick things up quick." Tommy blushed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thanks, Steve. I really love being here." I love learning about all of this. Steve nodded, his smile widening. Well, you're welcome here anytime. I think you've got a bright future ahead of you, Tommy. You keep working hard and who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one flying these things. Tommy's eyes widened, a spark of hope igniting inside of him. You really think so? Steve nodded. I know so. You've got the passion, Tommy, and that's what it takes. Tommy felt his chest swell with pride. It was like everything he had ever dreamed of was finally within reach. He looked at the plane, the metal gleaming under the hangar lights, and he knew that this was where he belonged. Later that evening, Tommy arrived back at the new apartment, his hands still stained with oil, his heart still racing from the excitement of the day. His mum was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and she looked up when he walked in, her face lighting up. How was it today? She asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Tommy grinned, dropping his bag by the door. It was amazing, Mom. I got to help with the pre-flight checks. Steve said I'm picking things up quick. His mom's eyes softened, a smile spreading across her face. I'm so proud of you, Tommy. You're really making something of yourself. Tommy walked over, giving her a hug. Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you. She hugged him back, her arms tightening around him. We're a team, remember? Tommy nodded, pulling back and giving her a smile. Always. They sat down to dinner, the small table covered with plates of steaming food. The new apartment felt different, brighter, more hopeful. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, then his mom spoke, her voice soft. Tommy, I've been thinking, now that things are better, maybe we could start planning for the future. I mean, really planning. What do you want to do? What do you dream about? Tommy looked at her, his heart pounding. He thought of the hangar, of the planes, of the feeling he got every time he stepped inside. He thought of Steve's words, that maybe one day he could be the one flying those planes. I want to be a pilot, Mom, he said, his voice steady. I want to learn everything I can. I want to fly. His mom's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. Then she smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I believe in you, Tommy. I know you can do it. Tommy nodded, his heart swelling. I'm going to work hard, Mom. I'm going to make it happen. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. And I'll be here every step of the way, cheering you on. Tommy squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with determination. It felt like everything was finally falling into place, that the future he had always dreamed of was within his reach. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, and he was ready to chase his dreams. A week later, Tommy was back at the hangar, standing with Steve as they worked on another plane. The sun was shining outside, the day bright and clear, and the hangar was bustling with activity. Tommy looked around, taking it all in, feeling a sense of pride swell within him. As they finished their work, Steve clapped Tommy on the back, a grin on his face. You did good today, Tommy. Real good. I'm telling you, you've got a future here. Tommy looked at Steve, his heart pounding. Do you really think I could be a pilot one day, Steve? Steve nodded, his eyes filled with sincerity. I know you can, Tommy. You've got the drive, the passion. You keep working hard, and you'll make it happen. Tommy felt a smile spread across his face, a warmth filling his chest. He looked at the plane in front of him, the metal gleaming under the lights, and he knew that this was where he was meant to be. He was ready to work hard, to learn, to chase his dreams. As he walked out of the hangar that day, Tommy looked up at the sky, the sun setting in the distance, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. It felt like the beginning of something new, something bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just a kid picking up cans anymore. He was someone with a future, someone with a dream, and he was ready to chase it, one step at a time. The following week, Tommy returned to the hangar once more. Each day, he felt himself grow more comfortable in this new world, more at home among the planes and the people who worked on them. Today, Steve had something special planned, though he hadn't given Tommy all the details. Tommy couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. When Tommy walked into the hangar, he spotted Steve waiting for him, standing next to a small jet. Steve waved, a grin on his face, and Tommy hurried over. "Morning, Steve," Tommy called, his voice carrying across the busy hangar. "Morning, Tommy," Steve replied. He gestured to the jet beside him, a sleek, shining aircraft that looked ready to take off at any moment. "Got a surprise for you today." Tommy's eyes widened as he looked at the plane, his heart skipping a beat. "A surprise? What kind of surprise?" Steve nodded toward the jet, his eyes twinkling. "How would you like to come up in the air with me today? Just a short flight, but I thought it was time you saw things from above." Tommy's jaw dropped, his eyes going wide. He could barely believe what he was hearing. "You mean, I can go up there? For real?" Steve chuckled, nodding. "For real, kid. Come on, let's get you strapped in." Tommy followed Steve to the side of the jet, his hands trembling slightly as they approached the stairs. He climbed up behind Steve, stepping into the cockpit, his eyes taking in every detail, the dials, the switches, the controls. It was all so real, so immediate, and it took his breath away. Steve handed Tommy a headset and showed him how to buckle in, his movements careful and precise. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest, a rush of excitement and nerves coursing through him. He could hardly believe this was happening, that he was actually about to go up in the air. "You ready?" Steve asked, turning to look at Tommy, a reassuring smile on his face. Tommy nodded, his voice catching in his throat. "Yeah, I'm ready." Steve started the engine, the roar vibrating through the plane, and Tommy felt his stomach do a flip. The noise was deafening at first, but then it settled into a steady hum, and Tommy found himself smiling. He looked out the window, watching as the hangar fell away behind them, the runway stretching out in front of them. Steve guided the plane out onto the runway, his voice calm as he explained each step. Tommy listened, his eyes wide, his heart pounding in his ears. This was it. This was what he had dreamed of. The plane began to pick up speed, and Tommy felt himself pressed back into his seat. He could feel every movement, every shift in the plane as they lifted off the ground. Tommy looked out the window, his breath catching as the ground fell away beneath them. The airport, the hangars, the people. They all grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing but specks. The sky opened up around them, endless and bright, and Tommy felt his chest swell with emotion.
The engine was reassembled, and Mr. Patterson came over to inspect their work, his eyes moving carefully over each part. He nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Excellent work," Mr. Patterson said, his voice full of approval. "You all did well today. Tyson, especially. You've come a long way in just a week. Keep this up, and you'll be handling these rebuilds on your own soon enough." Tyson felt his face break into a wide grin, his chest swelling with pride. He looked at Eric and Kayla, both of them giving him nods of approval. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged here, that he was part of something, part of a team that trusted him. After the final cleanup, Tyson changed out of his jumpsuit, putting it into his bag and heading for the bus stop. The ride home was quiet, and Tyson leaned his head against the window, watching as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the town beginning to fade into the evening shadows. He thought about everything, about how far he'd come in just a week, about the challenges he'd faced and the way he'd pushed through. When he got home, Marie was waiting for him on the porch, her eyes lighting up as she saw him step off the bus. She stood, walking over to meet him, her hands resting on his shoulders as she looked at him. "How was your day, Ty?" she asked, her voice gentle. Tyson smiled, his heart full. "It was amazing, Mom. We rebuilt an engine today. Patterson said I did well. He said I've come a long way." Marie's eyes glistened with tears, and she pulled Tyson into a hug, her voice trembling. "I'm so proud of you, Ty. You're doing it. You're really doing it." Tyson hugged her back, his eyes closing as he let himself feel the warmth of her embrace. This was why he was doing it. For her, for Roy, for the family that had given him everything they could. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt.
"Work hard, Mom. I'm going to make it happen." She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "And I'll be here every step of the way."
But he also knew that he had the strength to face them. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. They walked inside together, the smell of dinner wafting through the house. Roy was at the table, looking up as Tyson entered, a rare smile spreading across his face. "Kid, Jenkins called me earlier," Roy said, his voice gruff but warm. "He said you're a natural, said you've got a real future ahead of you." Tyson felt his heart swell, and he nodded, his voice thick. "Thanks, Uncle Roy, I'm just doing my best." Roy nodded, raising his glass in a toast. "Well, keep at it. You've got something special, Ty. Don't let anyone take that from you." They sat down to dinner, the three of them together, laughter and warmth filling the small kitchen. Tyson looked at his family, his mom's bright smile, Roy's proud nod, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead was still long, still uncertain, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his place, and he was ready for whatever came next.
Tommy felt a smile spread across his face, a warmth filling his chest. He looked at the plane in front of him, the metal gleaming under the lights, and he knew that this was where he was meant to be. He was ready to work hard, to learn, to chase his dreams. As he walked out of the hangar that day, Tommy looked up at the sky, the sun setting in the distance, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. It felt like the beginning of something new, something bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just a kid picking up cans anymore. He was someone with a future, someone with a dream, and he was ready to chase it, one step at a time. The following week, Tommy returned to the hangar once more. Each day, he felt himself grow more comfortable in this new world, more at home among the planes and the people who worked on them. Today, Steve had something special planned, though he hadn't given Tommy all the details. Tommy couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. When Tommy walked into the hangar, he spotted Steve waiting for him, standing next to a small jet. He looked at the logbook, then back at Mr. Thompson. "I don't know what to say. This is everything." Mr. Thompson reached out, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You earned this, Tommy. You've worked hard, and you deserve a chance to follow your dreams. I believe in you." Tommy swallowed hard, nodding. Thank you so much." Mr. Thompson smiled, then glanced at Steve. "Take good care of him, Steve. This kid's got a bright future." Steve nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "You got it, Mr. Thompson. We're going to make sure he gets there." As Mr. Thompson walked away, Tommy looked down at the logbook, a smile spreading across his face. He could feel the weight of it in his hands, the promise of the future, the dream that was finally within his reach. That night, Tommy returned home, the logbook tucked safely in his bag. He walked through the door, his heart pounding with excitement. His mom looked up from the couch, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Tommy, you're home. How was it today?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Tommy pulled the logbook out of his bag, holding it up for her to see. "Look, Mom, Mr. Thompson gave me this. It's a flight logbook. I'm going to start training." His mom's eyes widened, her mouth falling open in shock. She stood up, walking over to him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the logbook. "Tommy, this is incredible." Tommy nodded, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm going to do it, Mom. I'm going to learn to fly." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, her smile bright. "I knew you would, Tommy. I knew you could do anything you set your mind to." Tommy hugged her, holding her close, the logbook pressed between them. He could feel the hope, the promise of the future, the dream that was finally becoming real. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was someone with a purpose, with a future, with a dream that he was ready to chase. As they stood together in their new apartment, the city lights twinkling outside the window, Tommy looked out at the horizon, his heart swelling with hope. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there was so much more waiting for him. And he was ready to take flight, to soar, to chase his dreams and never look back.